There were places in the West where the wind carried more memory than the people who lived there. Dry Hollow was one of them, a stretch of sunburned hills, stubborn sagebrush, and fences weathered to the color of old bone. Out here, days didn't pass. They simply drifted, like dust rolling across the empty ground. For Abel Harkin, this was home, a quiet spread of cattle, a crooked barn, and a house that creaked whenever the night wind shifted. He had built most of it with his own hands, hands roughened by rope burns and splinters, the kind of hands that told stories even when he stayed silent. Every morning, Abel woke to the same sounds, the dry whistle of wind threading through the fence rails, the low bellow of a restless steer, and the deep, swallowing silence inside his cabin. It wasn't a painful silence, just the kind that settled over a man who'd spent too many years talking only to horses and hardwood beams. He used to have friends who rode by often, men who shared campfire jokes and long rides along the ridge. He used to have a heart that beat towards something, dreams of a life bigger than cattle and dust. But the West had a way of sanding a man down, smoothing out the soft edges until only what was necessary remained. Abel didn't complain. He worked his land from sunrise to sunset, moving with the steady patience of a man who knew the rhythm of the earth better than the rhythm of conversations. A man could survive a long time like that, quiet, functional, unbothered. And he might have kept living that way forever, if not for the girl who lived just beyond the property line. Her name was Mina. Abel didn't remember the first time he saw her, maybe because she always seemed to belong to the land itself, like she'd been there long before him. He'd catch glimpses of her whenever he rode near the boundary between their two properties. Some days she knelt among the wild herbs, gathering them with practiced, gentle fingers. Some days she led her horse toward the creek, humming a soft Apache melody that rose and fell like the breeze. Some days she simply stood in the tall grass, watching the clouds drift as if she understood their language. She smiled whenever their eyes met, a small, warm, unassuming smile. Nothing bold, nothing flirtatious, just kind. But her eyes, those held something deeper, a quiet sadness carved into them, the kind that reminded Abel of the deep cracks in the canyon walls, beautiful, ancient, and carrying stories she didn't speak aloud. To him, she was simply a good neighbor, gentle, respectful, always keeping to herself unless spoken to. She'd wave, he'd nod, and the world kept turning. Abel had never let his thoughts wander farther than that, not because she wasn't lovely, she was, but because lovely things had never belonged to him, not in this lifetime. And because men like him didn't go looking for trouble, especially not the kind wrapped in silence and soft smiles. Mina stayed on her side of the land, Abel stayed on his. That was the unspoken agreement between them, or so he thought. Dry Hollow was a small place, small enough that whispers traveled faster than horses. More than once, Abel overheard folks at the general store murmuring, "That Apache girl keeps glancing toward Harkin's ranch. Seems like she's got something on her mind." He brushed it off every time. People in Dry Hollow loved gossip more than rain, and Abel had no patience for either. If Mina looked his way, he figured it was because his cattle wandered too close to her herbs again, or because she was simply being polite. He didn't think anything of it. Not the lingering glances, not the quiet hum she carried in the air around her, not the way the late afternoon sun always seemed to find her first. Abel was a man grounded in routine, anchored in dust and duty. Change wasn't something he expected, and certainly not something he went looking for. But Dry Hollow had a cruel sense of humor, and fate had an even sharper one. Because everything Abel believed about his life, his solitude, and his place in the world would begin to crack open on the night of the campfire. The night when a harmless joke would strike the very heart of the one person he'd never thought to understand. The sun slipped behind the ragged hills of Dry Hollow, leaving streaks of copper and bruised lavender across the sky. Abel Harkin watched the last of the cattle settle behind the corral before hearing the familiar rumble of hooves and men's laughter rolling up the dirt road. His friends, dusty, loud, and carrying trouble the way other men carried whiskey, were arriving for the first real gathering Abel had agreed to in months. They came loaded like true cowboys, strips of salted beef wrapped in old cloth, a pot of bitter black coffee, a harmonica with dents in all the wrong places, and enough tall tales to keep the fire burning long after midnight. They fanned out across Abel's land as if it was their own, kicking loose stones, joking about the latest rumor in town, and teasing Abel for living more like a ghost than a rancher. Someone struck a match and dropped it into the pile of firewood by the creek. Flames rose quick and bright, licking up the dry kindling, casting a warm orange glow over the dusty boots and worn hats circling the pit. The scent of pine sap and smoke drifted into the cool evening air. Then Mina appeared. She approached quietly as she always did, walking with the soft, grounded grace of someone who understood the land better than anyone else there. She carried a woven basket against her hip, a basket filled with warm corn cakes she'd baked herself. The men welcomed her without hesitation, offering space at the circle, tipping their hats respectfully. Even the rowdiest among them knew better than to disrespect an Apache woman with eyes as steady as hers. Abel didn't see her at first. He was pouring coffee, pretending he wasn't nervous about having a crowd on his property. But when he turned and caught her standing between the firelight and the deepening dusk, something in him stalled, just for a moment. Mina smiled softly, holding out the basket. "Thought you all might want something sweet." It was nothing unusual, just an act of neighborly kindness. Yet the sound of her voice mixed with the warmth of the fire did something to the tightness in Abel's chest. He didn't recognize the feeling, but he did notice how easily the noise around him faded when she stepped closer. As the night grew darker, the fire grew brighter. Mina settled down near the circle, close enough that the smoke curled around her hair, blending with the herbal scent she always carried. Sage, cedar, maybe something wild he couldn't name. The fragrance drifted in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like a quiet reminder that she lived between two worlds, her people's traditions and the rough American West that pressed around them. Abel tried to focus on his friend's stories, but his gaze kept drifting toward her. The firelight played tricks across her face, softening her features, turning her brown eyes molten, throwing gentle shadows across her cheekbones. When she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, he felt a strange pull in his stomach. Something like unease but warmer, almost welcome. He didn't understand it, and he didn't like feeling off balance, but he couldn't deny it either. Mina laughed at a joke someone made, not loudly but with genuine warmth. The sound came lightly like wind chimes on a porch. Abel noticed she sat closer to the fire than usual, closer to him too. Not enough for anyone else to pay attention, but enough that he felt the shift. And for reasons he couldn't explain, it didn't bother him at all. In fact, it eased something inside him. The evening rolled on in a slow, easy rhythm. Men passed around strips of beef. Someone brewed another pot of coffee so strong it could wake the dead. And the harmonica wailed a tune that drifted along the creek bed like a lonely coyote call. But beneath the laughter and music, a strange stillness hummed in Abel's chest. For the first time in many months, maybe years, he wasn't thinking about the loneliness waiting back inside his cabin. He wasn't thinking about tomorrow's work, the broken fence on the north side, or the calf he needed to check on at dawn. He was simply there, present, listening to the fire crackle and watching the way Mina's smile flickered in the dancing light. It felt easy, it felt dangerous. It felt like the land itself had shifted a little under his boots. Mina's presence didn't fill the silence of his life, but it changed the shape of it. And though Abel didn't yet understand the quiet pull drawing him toward her, the night air carried a truth he was not ready to face. This peace, this warmth, would not stay simple for long. Something was moving toward him, slow but certain, like a storm building far beyond the hills. And Mina, she was closer to its center than he could possibly know. The fire had burned low by the time the teasing began, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the night. The men were loose-limbed with laughter and black coffee, their voices rolling across the creek bed, echoing off the stony hills. Abel sat with his boots dug into the dirt, feeling unusually relaxed, even comfortable, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Mina's quiet presence beside the flames had softened the edges of the world around him, more than the warmth of the fire ever could. One of the cowboys, Tommy Garner, the rowdiest of the bunch, and already 3 cups of coffee past good sense, leaned forward with a mischievous grin. His hat was crooked, his face flushed with the satisfaction of having found the perfect moment to stir trouble. "Well now," Tommy hollered, waving a hand dramatically. If Abel here's so damn lonely, why doesn't he just marry his Apache neighbor and call it a day? Laughter exploded around the fire, loud and carefree. Someone slapped their knee, another tossed a pebble toward Abel's boot, and even the harmonica player snorted into his cup. The joke wasn't new. Small towns had small conversations, but tonight it caught like a spark in dry grass. Abel didn't think about it, didn't pause, didn't sense the ground shifting beneath him. He just lifted his tin cup, gave a half smile the way cowboys do when they're pretending something doesn't bother them, and said, "Well, if Mina wants it, we can get married right now. Ain't no trouble." The words left his mouth smooth, light, tossed into the air like dust. It was meant to be harmless, a simple joke tossed back at the boys to shut them up. But the moment the syllables touched the night, something cracked open. The laughter died abruptly, as if someone had blown out a lantern. Tommy froze mid-chuckle. The harmonica fell silent. Men who had been leaning forward now straightened, glancing between Abel and the girls sitting in the glow of the campfire. Mina didn't laugh. Not even a breath of amusement passed her lips. Instead, she stared at Abel, her dark eyes wide and unguarded in a way he had never seen before. The firelight didn't dance for her now. It held still, reflecting the depth of something raw and aching inside her. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The air thickened, heavy as monsoon humidity before the storm breaks. Abel felt it first in his chest, a tightening, an unease, a recognition that he had accidentally stepped into something alive, something delicate. Mina's gaze didn't waver, didn't soften, didn't turn away. It struck him, not like a bullet, but like the moment right before it hits, when silence rings louder than sound. And then she spoke. Her voice was small but steady, as if pulled from a place she'd locked away. "I thought you'd never say it." 5 quiet words, but they fell like a stone into still water. Ripples spreading, touching everything. The cowboys exchanged uncertain glances. Tommy cleared his throat. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. No one dared laugh anymore. Abel felt the heat rise under his collar, not from the fire, but from a sudden, unexplainable sense of responsibility pressing against his ribs. His casual grin melted. His hand tightened around the tin cup until the metal creaked. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again, but no sound came, because Mina wasn't teasing. She wasn't flattered. She wasn't embarrassed. She was honest. Painfully, terrifyingly honest. Her eyes held years of quiet longing. Years of watching him mend fences, ride past her family's land, tip his hat politely without ever seeing what trembled beneath her calm smile. He felt the weight of every glance he had overlooked, every smile he had returned without thinking, every moment that had meant nothing to him, but everything to her. "Damn," Abel whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He set the cup down slowly, his heartbeat loud enough to drown out the crackling fire. He hadn't meant it. He hadn't expected anything from her. He hadn't realized the truth waiting beneath the joke. But now he saw it, clear as the moon rising over the ridge. He had touched something real, and there are few things more dangerous in the West than a truth spoken out loud. Around him, the night felt suddenly fragile, poised on the edge of a shift he couldn't stop. The men sensed it too, shuffling quietly, unsure if they should stay or leave. Mina's gaze broke only when she lowered her eyes, her breath unsteady, as though admitting that single sentence had cost her far more courage than any of them could understand. Abel wasn't a man easily shaken, but in that moment, the quiet admission, the flickering firelight, the truth he had never bothered to see, Abel Harkin realized he had just crossed a line he didn't even know existed, and there was no going back. The fire behind them still crackled, but its warmth no longer reached Abel. Every sound, the shifting boots, the clinking tin cups, the murmured whispers, blurred into a distant hum. What stayed sharp, what cut clean through the night, was the look on Mina's face after his careless joke. A look he did not know how to read, yet could not ignore. Before he could gather himself, Mina stepped toward him. "Abel," she said quietly, "come with me, please." There was no tremor in her voice, only a steadiness that made the stars above feel suddenly colder. She walked ahead, and he followed without a word. They left the circle of firelight, heading toward the old split-rail fence that marked the boundary between their lands. Moonlight spilled across the grass, washing the earth in silver. Mina stopped where the fence dipped slightly, a place Abel had mended more than once. She stood tall, shoulders squared, though her hands, he noticed, trembled ever so slightly at her sides. He swallowed. "Mina, I didn't mean to." She raised a hand gently, stopping him. Her eyes held a storm he had never been allowed to see. "For years," she began softly, "I've tried to keep my heart quiet, tried to tell myself you were just a neighbor, someone kind, someone distant." The wind moved her hair, carrying the scent of sage toward him. "But feelings don't listen, Abel. Not in the desert, not in a woman's chest, not in mine." He felt the words hit him, slow, steady, impossible to dodge. "I've cared for you," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "Longer than I should admit. Quietly, like the way the wind moves through the canyon at night. Never loud, but always there." She looked away for a moment, jaw tightening with the weight of things long unsaid. "But I didn't hope," she added. "Not really, because I'm Apache. And you belong to a world that doesn't always welcome mine." Abel felt something twist in his gut, an ache he didn't recognize, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd never thought of her that way, separated by lines drawn long before either of them were born. But now, hearing her speak it aloud, he understood how heavy that truth must have been for her. "Mina," he said quietly, stepping closer. "I didn't know." She gave a soft, almost broken laugh. "I never wanted you to know. I never wanted to burden you. I told myself it was enough just to watch you ride past each morning, fixing fences, tending cattle, living your life. I told myself your kindness was just kindness, nothing more." She lifted her eyes again, and this time the pain in them was bare, unguarded. "But when you said those words tonight, joking or not, it felt like someone had finally spoken aloud what I spent years trying to bury." The moon hung low behind her, pale against the velvet sky. Abel stared at her, the weight of her confession pressing against his ribs until breathing felt difficult. "I had no idea," he admitted, voice low and rough. "Mina, if I'd known, if I'd seen even part of this sooner, maybe I wouldn't have let you stand out here alone for so long." It was not smooth, not poetic. Abel was not a man of fancy phrases, but the truth in his voice was raw enough to make Mina's breath hitch. For the first time, he really looked at her. Not as the girl who lived beyond the fence, not as the quiet Apache neighbor with a basket of herbs, but as a woman who carried years of unspoken longing in her bones. Something shifted inside him, quiet, startling, irreversible. As if a door he didn't know existed opened wide, letting in a warmth he'd kept shut out for years. A warmth that frightened him almost as much as it steadied him. Mina exhaled shakily. "I don't expect anything from you," she murmured. "I only needed you to know, because your joke, it wasn't a joke to me. Not tonight." Abel stepped closer still, until the fence between their lands was the only thing separating them. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt you, but I can't pretend those words didn't mean something to me either. Not after tonight, not after hearing all this." Mina's eyes widened, not with hope, but with the startled ache of a heart that had prepared itself for rejection. But Abel wasn't pulling away. He didn't touch her, didn't promise anything he couldn't understand yet. But the way he looked at her, steady, open, almost tender, was a shift as real as any sunrise. And in that moment, under the lonely, dry, hollow moon, something inside Abel Harkin cracked open, letting the possibility of her, of them, spill quietly into the night. A door in his heart had opened, and he knew deep in his bones there was no closing it now. The days that followed did not rush. They didn't collide or roar the way storms do across the desert. Instead, they drifted in quietly, soft, dusty, golden, settling into the spaces between Abel and Mina like the warm breath of late summer. Nothing grand happened, no declarations, no promises whispered under cottonwood trees. But something shifted nevertheless. Ever since that night by the split-rail fence, the air between them carried a different weight. A tenderness so careful and fragile it felt almost sacred. The first time Mina came by afterward, she didn't come with words. She came with a jar of honey, thick and amber, something she'd gathered from hives tucked deep in the canyon. She held it with both hands, shy but steady, as though she wasn't sure if she was offering a gift or a piece of herself. Abel accepted it slowly, his fingers brushing hers for just a heartbeat too long. A warmth spread through him, not the awkward heat of embarrassment, but something gentler, like a lantern being lit inside a dark cabin. The next day, he left a folded piece of tanned deer hide on the fence line. No note, no explanation, just an offering, simple and honest. Mina found it at dusk. He watched from a distance as she ran her fingers over the smooth leather, her smile small but unmistakably real. Little exchanges like that began stitching themselves into the rhythm of their days. Small, unspoken acknowledgments of something growing quietly between them. And every time they crossed paths, their conversation slowed, warmed, lingered in the air longer than they should. Mina would talk about the wild herbs sprouting early along the ridge. Abel would mention a stubborn calf that kept escaping the pen. Mina laughed softly. Abel smiled more easily than usual. Tiny things, ordinary things, but wrapped in them was something steady, tender, meaningful, something neither of them dared name yet. Life in Dry Hollow, however, never stayed blind for long. By the third week, the whispers started. At the general store, two women pretended to sort flour while murmuring, "That Apache girl's been visiting the Harkin Ranch more often, hasn't she?" "Well, have you noticed Abel?" Man's been smiling to himself like he swallowed sunshine. At the saloon, men leaned over dusty counters. "Think Abel finally found someone to settle him down?" "Maybe. Heard she's got eyes only for him." Even the blacksmith chuckled when Abel walked in for nails. "You fixing fences or building a house big enough for two?" Abel brushed it all off with his usual quiet grunt, but his ears burned hotter than the forge fire. Not because he felt ashamed, but because there was a strange truth buried in their teasing, one he wasn't ready to hold steady in his hands. But the worst part wasn't the rumors. It was how easily he reacted to them. Because every time someone mentioned Mina's name, a warmth, uninvited, undeniable, rose in his chest. And every time he saw her walking toward his land, carrying herbs or honey or simply the soft rhythm of her footsteps, something inside him tightened in a way he could no longer ignore. One late afternoon, after checking the northern fence, Abel paused on the ridge overlooking Mina's home. Smoke curled from the chimney. Her horse grazed lazily in the shade. Mina herself walked across her yard, her braids swinging gently in the wind as she carried a basket of plants inside. And something hit him, quiet yet powerful. Fear. Not fear of her, not fear of the gossip, but fear of missing something. Something good, something rare, by staying silent too long. He leaned heavily against the fence, breath shallow. It startled him how quickly she had woven herself into the quiet corners of his mind. How often he caught himself listening for her footsteps, or noticing the way his cabin felt less cold after speaking to her. Each time he saw her, that warmth in his chest returned, steady, persistent, impossible to ignore. Maybe it had been there longer than he realized. Maybe he'd been too stubborn, too busy, too afraid to notice. But now, after her confession, after the trembling honesty in her voice, after seeing her smile over the deer hide he'd gifted, Abel Harkin knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just neighborly kindness anymore. And if he didn't act, if he didn't say something, do something, he might lose the one thing that had breathed life into his quiet, lonely world. The sunset washed Dry Hollow in shades of orange and gold, dust dancing in the fading light like tiny sparks drifting from a dying fire. Abel placed his hands on the rough wood of the fence and exhaled slowly. He wasn't ready to name what he felt, but he was terrified of losing it. The wind came first that night, low, restless, moving across the plains like a wandering thought that refused to settle. Abel sat at his small wooden table, sharpening a pocket knife out of habit more than necessity. The room was quiet except for the scratch of metal on stone and the soft groan of the old cabin walls bending under the gusts. Then came the knock. Not rushed, not hesitant, just a gentle tapping, like someone who hoped he was home but wasn't certain. Abel's pulse kicked once, a small, startled jump. He set the knife down and crossed the room, each step heavier with something he didn't want to name. When he opened the door, there she was, Mina. Her braid was loose, strands dancing in the wind. Her shawl pressed close to her shoulders, and the moonlight lit her face with a pale, quiet glow. "Abel," she said softly, "are you free to take a walk? Just for a little while?" He didn't even think before answering. "Yeah, let me grab my coat." Moments later, they stepped into the night together. The wind tugged at their clothes, carrying the scent of wild sage and cool earth. They walked side by side toward the creek, their shadows moving across the dust like two stories slowly aligning. The moon hung low, bright enough to paint the flowing water in silver. Crickets filled the silence, a gentle chorus that made the world feel smaller, more intimate. They followed the creek bed, neither speaking at first. Mina kept her eyes ahead, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, as if steadying something delicate inside herself. Finally, just as they reached the bend where the water widened and smoothed, she asked, "Abel, did that night by the fire make things difficult for you?" He stopped walking, letting the question settle into the space between them. The moonlight caught her face, open, searching, almost afraid of the answer she already braced herself for. He took a breath. "No," he said honestly. "It didn't make me uncomfortable. It just made me realize I needed time to understand what I'm feeling." Mina's brows lifted slightly, her breath catching. Abel ran a hand along the back of his neck. "I've lived a long time thinking loneliness was just part of the deal. You work the land, you sleep early, you keep breathing. I didn't expect anything else. Didn't think anything else was meant for me." He looked at her fully now, the truth gathering in his chest like warm, rising air. "But when you told me how you felt, something changed. Maybe I didn't see it before. Maybe I didn't let myself." His voice dropped, steady, sincere. "But I want to try, Mina, if you want to." The wind softened, as though the night itself was listening. For a moment, Mina didn't speak. She just stared at him, her expression trembling between relief and disbelief. Her eyes glimmered, not with tears, but with a fragile hope she had tried so long to quiet. Then she took a tiny, almost imperceptible step closer. "Abel," she whispered, "I wouldn't have asked you on this walk if I didn't want the same thing." Something inside him loosened, a knot he'd carried for years without realizing it. He nodded slowly, letting the moment settle. No grand promises, no wild declarations. Just a shared agreement, simple and honest, shaped by the soft moonlight and the steady rush of the creek. As they continued walking, their shoulders brushed briefly, accidental, gentle, but it sent a ripple through both of them. A few minutes passed before Abel tried something braver. He reached down, palm open, fingers unsure, offering, not demanding. Mina didn't hesitate. Her hand slid into his with a softness that felt like the world-changing shape. Warm, small, steady. The kind of touch that didn't pull him forward or hold him back, just anchored him in the moment. They walked like that, hand in hand, letting the silence speak for them. Nothing loud, nothing rushed, just a quiet understanding settling deep in their bones. They both knew, without saying it, there was no going back to how things were. Not after this. Not after choosing each other in the silver glow of a dry, hollow night. In Dry Hollow, love didn't arrive in grand gestures or poetic promises. It settled in quietly, the same way dust clung to saddle leather or dawn crept over the horizon. For Abel and Mina, the shift didn't happen all at once. It unfolded gently, woven into the small, ordinary hours of their days. After their walk by the creek, Mina began stopping by more often. Not with heavy expectations, not with nervous questions, just with her steady presence. The kind that wrapped itself around the ranch like a warm, familiar blanket. Some mornings she came early, her hair braided, carrying a small basket of herbs. Other days, Abel would see her walking across the field as he hammered new shingles onto the barn roof. He always paused just for a breath, watching her silhouette against the open land. They worked together without much talking. Mina helped him spread hay across the drying racks, moving with a graceful rhythm that belonged to someone raised close to the earth. Abel watched her sometimes, not deliberately, but in those accidental moments when a person forgets to hide what they feel. The strength in her arms, the sure, quiet way she carried herself, the gentle hum of an Apache tune floating around her. All of it settled into him, steady and grounding. Abel repaired loose boards on the chicken coop, tightened hinges on the barn door, and replaced cracked slats in the corral fence. And Mina was there, not directing, not fussing, just offering small practical help. Handing him nails, steadying a ladder, brushing dust off her skirt with an easy, sunlit smile. It wasn't romance the way people in novels described it. It was simpler, truer, a kind of partnership that grew like desert grass. Slow, stubborn, resilient. Abel began waking differently. For years, he'd opened his eyes to silence. Heavy, cold, the kind that pressed on his chest before he even sat up. But now mornings felt lighter, He'd wake remembering the way Mina laughed the evening before, or how her hand had lingered against his when passing him a tool. The cabin didn't feel as empty. The ranch didn't feel as lonely. Sometimes he'd catch himself smiling for no reason at all, a strange habit for a man who had spent half his life wearing seriousness like armor, and the townsfolk noticed. "Look at Harkin," someone whispered at the feed store. "Smiling before noon? The world must be ending." But the world wasn't ending, it was opening. For Mina, the change was quieter, more internal. Her entire life, she'd lived with the push and pull between cultures, always careful not to misstep, not to hope too openly. But with Abel, something inside her settled, like a stone finally finding its place in the riverbed. When she worked beside him, she felt safe in a way she couldn't quite explain. Not protected, not sheltered. Mina didn't need rescuing. It was something deeper, a sense that someone finally saw her, not as the Apache girl next door, not as an outsider, but simply as herself. She caught herself humming more. She lingered at his fence even when she had nothing to give. She watched him from the porch as he led cattle at dusk, the sky turning gold behind him. His steadiness made her steady. His quiet made space for her own quiet. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe she might belong somewhere, someone, without needing to erase who she was. As for Abel, feelings didn't come to him like lightning. They came like dusk, slow, creeping, softening everything before he realized night had fallen. He didn't tell himself he was in love. He didn't name it out loud, but he felt it. In the way he scanned the horizon to see if she was coming. In the way he saved the sweeter apples for her horse. In the way his chest tightened, warm, solid, whenever she smiled at him like he was something good. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was Western, quiet, weathered, built to last. And one late afternoon, as Mina stacked the last of the hay and brushed her hands clean, Abel stood beside her, the sun sinking orange behind them. He watched her in a silence thick with unspoken meaning. He didn't say the words, not yet. But he realized then, with a certainty as deep as the land he stood on, he was falling in love with her, slowly, steadily, irreversibly. Abel Harkin was not a man easily shaken. Years of ranch work had carved him into something steady, quiet, dependable, rooted like the cottonwoods along the creek. But in the week after he realized he loved Mina, a strange energy began to follow him around the ranch like a restless horse. Everywhere he went, fixing fence posts, hauling hay, saddling his mare, one thought trailed behind him. If you love her, say it. If you want her, ask. It wasn't a loud thought, not dramatic or impatient, just persistent, honest, true. One morning before the sun had fully climbed past the ridge, Abel rode into town. The sky was pale lavender, the streets still empty except for the early wagon heading toward the market. He tied his horse outside the small trading post, took a breath that felt heavier than it should, and pushed open the wooden door. Inside, the air smelled of leather, cedarwood, and old memories. Behind the counter stood Mr. Calhoun, the storekeeper, a man who had seen more proposals, heartbreaks, and reconciliations in Dry Hollow than anyone else. He lifted his brows as Abel approached. "Well now," Calhoun said, polishing his spectacles. "You look like a man with something weighty on his mind." Abel cleared his throat. "I need a ring, silver." Calhoun didn't blink. "For her?" Abel hesitated, not out of doubt, but because the word her suddenly felt too small for everything Mina was to him. "Yeah, for Mina." The storekeeper nodded knowingly, disappearing into a back shelf. He returned with a small velvet pouch and opened it to reveal a simple silver band, smooth, polished, etched with Apache floral patterns, crafted by a local silversmith who honored the tribe's traditional designs. Abel held the ring between his fingers. It was not extravagant, not flashy, just honest, quiet, meaningful. It carried the spirit of Mina's people, the land she came from, the stories she carried in her bones. It felt right. "I'll take it," Abel said, voice steady. As he rode home, the ring safe in his coat pocket, the wind whipped around him with a strange blend of exhilaration and fear. Love, he realized, was not soft, not for a man like him. It was raw, humbling, powerful as a flood. And proposing to Mina felt like stepping across an invisible line he'd never dared approach before. He chose the place without hesitation, the clearing by the creek, the exact spot where the campfire once burned, where the joke had fallen, where Mina's confession shattered and remade his world. That night had cracked something open between them. Tonight, he hoped to build something permanent in its place. Near sunset, Abel arrived early. The sky glowed in warm shades of gold and dusty rose, casting long shadows across the prairie grass. He moved with nervous energy, smoothing the ground with his boot, adjusting his collar, rehearsing words that sounded clumsy even in his own head. He had faced storms, wild bulls, and long winters alone. None of it made him this tense. When Mina finally appeared at the edge of the clearing, her braid catching the last light, Abel felt his breath hitch. She wore a simple dress, earth-toned and soft, blending with the land in that effortless way she always did. She approached slowly, confusion tugging at her features. "Abel?" she asked gently. "Why do you look nervous?" He realized then that she could read him more easily than he read himself. Another reminder, another truth, that he was already hers in ways he didn't know how to explain. He stepped forward, every movement deliberate, as if the ground itself demanded honesty. "Mina," he began, voice low but unwavering, "I asked you to come here because this is where everything changed for me." Her brows lifted slightly, the wind brushing loose strands across her cheek. He swallowed, feeling the ring like a burning ember in his pocket. "That night, when you told me what you felt, I didn't know what to do with it. I'd never been given something so real, something so important." Mina took a small step closer, her breath unsteady. Abel's voice softened, carrying the weight of a man who never spoke more than necessary. "But now I know, and if you'll let me, I want to walk the rest of my days with you." Her eyes widened, not with shock this time, but with a tremble of hope so deep it nearly undid him. He reached into his pocket, fingers curling around the cool silver. And Mina, seeing the motion, pressed a hand to her mouth. Not in fear, not in disbelief, but in the quiet, overwhelming recognition of a dream she never allowed herself to imagine would come true. The wind had quieted by the time Abel reached into his coat pocket. The last light of sunset lingered over the clearing, painting the grass and dirt in warm shades of red and gold, like the land itself was holding its breath for what came next. Mina stood only a few steps away, her hands clasped at her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion, worry, and something softer, something he hoped was the beginning of joy. Abel drew in a slow breath. "Mina," he began, voice steady but rough around the edges, "I need to say something true. From here." He pressed a hand briefly to his chest. "From my heart." She didn't move, didn't interrupt, just watched him like she was afraid the moment might vanish if she blinked too long. He took one step closer, closing the distance between them until he could feel the warmth of her presence. "Back at that fire," he said quietly, "when I made that joke, I didn't think twice. I was just trying to shut the boys up before they said something worse. I never meant to hurt you, and never meant to make light of something that mattered to you." Mina inhaled sharply but stayed silent. Abel's voice lowered, softened. "But from the moment you looked at me that night, nothing in me was a joke anymore. Not a single thing." The words settled in the air like dust after thunder, slow, honest, inescapable. Mina's lips parted, but whatever she was about to say slipped away before it formed. Abel swallowed hard, then slowly bent down on one knee. Not with dramatic flair, not with rehearsed elegance, just a simple, earnest movement, one that carried the weight of truth he hadn't allowed himself to speak until now. He opened his palm, revealing the silver ring carved with Apache floral patterns, and the moonlight glinted off its edges like a quiet blessing. "Mina?" He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the dusty glow of the land around them. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" For a long, breathless moment, Mina didn't speak. Her hands flew to her mouth, trembling. Tears began to fill her eyes. Not loud, not dramatic, just rising slowly, spilling silently the way desert rain begins. Gentle, unexpected, overwhelming. She shook her head, not to say no, but in disbelief, in relief, in the stunned release of a hope she'd spent years holding down. "I thought," her voice cracked, soft as the wind brushing through prairie grass, "I thought you would never ask again. I thought that night was the closest I'd ever be to hearing those words." Abel's chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with a swelling warmth he couldn't fully grasp. He had never been a man of fancy speeches, never been smooth with words, But hearing her voice tremble like that cut him deeper than any confession he'd ever known. "Mina," he murmured, "I should have said this sooner. I should have seen you sooner. But I see you now, truly." She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as if a lifetime of worry and longing had finally found a place to land. Then she nodded. Not a quick nod, not a shy one, but a slow, steady, grounding nod. One that carried the truth of everything they'd lived separately and everything they were about to build together. "Yes," she whispered, voice shaking but sure. "Yes, Abel, I'll marry you." Abel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for years broke apart like dry twigs underfoot. With a reverence he didn't know he possessed, he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it was crafted just for her, just for this moment. Mina knelt down beside him then, not because tradition asked her to, but because her heart did. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her forehead to his, tears still falling, breath shaky and full of a joy too large to name. For a few seconds the world fell away. No gossip, no history, no fear. Just the two of them on Dry Hollow's red earth, where a careless joke once wounded them, and where the truest promise of their lives now began. Abel closed his eyes, holding her close. Everything was different now. Everything was right. And with that single trembling nod, their futures had shifted, quietly, powerfully, forever. The wedding wasn't grand. It wasn't dressed in lace or lined with gold. It happened in the open yard of Abel's ranch, under a sky so wide it felt like a blessing in itself. The ground was swept clean, the old barn roof draped with wildflowers Mina gathered from the hills, and lanterns hung from fence posts, glowing softly as evening settled over Dry Hollow. People came, more than Abel ever expected. The townsfolk arrived first, carrying pies and blankets, tipping their hats awkwardly at the Apache elders. Then came Mina's people, calm, dignified, moving with the quiet strength of the desert wind. They stood beside cowboys with dust still on their boots, beside ranch wives holding jars of jam, beside children who darted excitedly through the crowd. For once, Dry Hollow wasn't divided by lines drawn long before anyone there was born. For once, everyone shared the same sun, the same dust, the same gentle joy. When Mina stepped into the yard wearing a simple cream-colored dress stitched by her aunt, the crowd fell into a hush. Her hair was braided with small silver beads, catching the lantern light like drops of moon. Abel, standing by the wooden arch made from two old fence rails, felt his breath leave him completely. She walked toward him with soft steps, and the entire world felt steady. Pastor Turner said a few words, simple, honest words about partnership, land, and the quiet kind of devotion that doesn't need poetry to be real. One of the Apache elders added a blessing in his own language, sprinkling crushed sage into the breeze. Abel and Mina exchanged vows that were not rehearsed or perfect, but pure. When he slipped the silver ring onto her finger, the one carved with Apache patterns, the small crowd erupted into applause. Cowboys whooping, women laughing, children tossing wildflower petals in the air. And for the first time in a very long time, Abel Harkin felt completely, quietly whole. The days that followed didn't transform into fairy tales. They simply softened. The house that once echoed with Abel's loneliness began to fill with new sounds. Mina humming while grinding herbs by the window. The creak of floorboards as the two of them moved in step around each other. The warm crackle of a shared fire at night. They repaired the sagging porch together, Mina handing nails while Abel hammered. They planted new grass near the south pasture, watching the green shoots push through the earth. A young colt was born in early spring, a spirited little thing Mina insisted on naming after the moon because of the white mark on its forehead. Every morning, Abel opened the door and saw her, hair tumbling from sleep, eyes warm as sunrise, smile soft and unguarded. And that alone felt like a kind of wealth he'd never dreamed of owning. Nights were even quieter, the kind of quiet that wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. Mina would sit with her knees tucked beneath her, weaving or grinding herbs, while Abel whittled wood or mended tack. Sometimes she'd lean her head against his shoulder. Sometimes he'd reach for her hand beneath the table. No drama, no firestorms, just the steady peace of two lives finally in rhythm. It wasn't perfect. Some days were hard. Work was endless. The land demanded everything, but they faced it the way Western folk always had, shoulder to shoulder, with grit and a quietly blooming tenderness. In the end, their story wasn't about fireworks or gunfights or sweeping declarations shouted into the canyon. It was about something simpler, something older, something truer. Love in the West did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it grew out of silence, out of small gestures, out of a single careless joke that turned out not to be careless at all. It began with two lonely hearts, a silver ring, a steady courage, and the willingness to walk toward each other, even when the world said their paths were too different to ever cross. They proved the world wrong, because all it took was one honest moment, one unexpected confession, and two people brave enough to choose the quiet miracle of belonging. And that, more than any legend of Gunsmoke or frontier glory, is how love truly survives in the West.